Well, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Uh, Welcome to CBA's Unbound Book Review. Today on Anathea Portier-Young's The Prophetic Body, Embodiment and Mediation in Biblical Prophetic Literature by Oxford University Press. Thea's from Duke University, as you all know. She specializes in biblical prophetic literature and early Jewish apocalyptic literature and novellas and historiographic literature and late Second Temple period. Her teaching and research also include practical application of scripture for social justice and preaching. Um, so we also have a wonderful panel this morning who are going to respond to Thea's book. Um, um, Jamie Waters will be our first respondent. Jamie is Associate Professor of Old Testament and the Program Director of Courage to Preach at, Boston College. She holds graduate degrees from Yale Divinity School, an MA in Religion, and Johns Hopkins University, an MA and a PhD in Near Eastern Studies. Dr. Waters is working on a commentary on the book of Jeremiah for Wisdom Commentary Series with Liturgical Press, and a book on methods of biblical interpretation with Baker Academic. And she also used to teach at Catholic Studies at DePaul University. Our second panelist will be Esther Brown-Smith. Esther is an assistant professor of Hebrew Bible at the University of Dayton. She holds a doctorate from Brandeis University and conducted postdoctoral research at MF Norwegian School of Theology and Religion and Society. She's the author of Gendered Violence in Biblical Narrative, The Devouring Metaphor. That sounds really interesting. And the winner of the AGS Jordan Schnitzer First Book Publication Award, which is forthcoming in Routledge's series, The Ancient Word. She's the editor-in-chief of forthcoming Unruly Books, Rethinking Ancient and Academic Imaginations of Religious Texts. Our third panelist is Julia Claessens. Julia is at the Department of Old and New Testaments at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Today she has the Center of Gender Studies, I guess it would be, right, Julia? Is that correct? Something like that?
So it's the head of the gender unit, also at our faculty, yes.
Okay. She has her PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary in 2001. Her latest writings include Jonah in the Old Testament Library series from Westminster John Knox and Writing and Reading to Survive, a Biblical and Contemporary Trauma Narratives in Conversation from Sheffield Phoenix Press. And then our final panelist will be Megan Henning, who has been one of our stars in our series of Unbound book reviews. Megan is the Associate Professor of Christian Origins at the University of Dayton. She specializes in New Testament and early Christianity. She holds a doctorate in New Testament from Emory University. Megan's first book from Moore Seebeck on the pedagogical function of hell, I always find that funny, in antiquity is entitled Educating Early Christians Through the Rhetoric of Hell. Her second book, which was in our Unbound book review series, Hell Hath No Fury, Gender, Disability, and the Invention of Damned Bodies in Early Christianity from Yale University Press, examines hell through the lenses of gender and disability studies. Was that our first Unbound book review, I think?
I believe so.
Yeah. So, and it went over really well. It was great. So, and all of them have just followed suit. So you set a benchmark and everybody's trying to keep up with it since then. So really looking forward to a great discussion this morning. So I think what we do is Thea is going to introduce her book, and then we'll follow with the panelists. And then we'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and Thea will respond to the panelists' comments, and then we'll open up a discussion with everybody, and anyone in the audience will be allowed to join in with comments or questions. So Thea, I turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much for those introductions, Archie. So often when we study biblical prophets, we focus on the prophetic word. And this book, ta-da, centers the body and the relationship between word and body. Embodied life is at the heart of the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament, and I would argue that it is the ground of biblical imagination and of human relationship with one another, with God, with non-human creation. But even so, modern culture teaches us to denigrate the body. And Western tradition has long conceived of body as separate from mind, spirit, or soul, and rated it less important, less valuable, even dishonorable and dangerous. And as a result, studies of religion, God, the Bible, and spirituality have often distanced themselves from analysis of what we experience in our bodies. It's shaped by biases like that. Modern biblical scholarship predominantly conceives of prophecy as a verbal phenomenon. Whether through spoken utterance or written text, the prophet is commonly understood as a mouthpiece, a spokesperson, or a messenger for the deity, while prophecy is frequently identified with the word or the message that the prophet conveys at the deity's behest. In this logocentric model of biblical prophecy, words very often float above the body, while the prophet's embodied experience, affect, actions, and interactions function only to authenticate the messenger or illustrate the message they bear. And I would say that a focus on words is partly correct. Christian and Jewish scriptural canons preserve what we've come to call books of prophetic literature. Oracles, sayings, and speech acts are central to the work of many biblical prophetic figures. We know the formulas, thus says the Lord, and word of the Lord, and those yoke together divine and prophetic speech. So the importance of words, speech, and communication for understanding the phenomena we call biblical prophecy is undeniable. But they're only part of the picture. And a near exclusive focus on words divorces word and body and generates a truncated picture of prophetic experience, action, and reception, and an incomplete understanding of prophecy. Now, biblical studies has in recent years seen a turn to the body that has prompted growing attention to diverse aspects of embodiment in the study of biblical prophetic literature. And that's helped us to supplement this understanding of prophecy as word and message with consideration of diverse ways that prophecy is also embodied. But what we haven't seen yet is a more fully integrative account of prophetic embodiment. And the prophetic body, this book, lays the foundation for that kind of integrative account. Now, it must be said that comprehensive treatment of prophetic embodiment exceeds the scope of what one book alone can do. So this book that we're talking about today is the first installment in a planned trilogy on the theme of prophecy in the body. And so the project, as a broader project, aims to correct this logocentric bias that has governed so much of modern study of biblical prophecy. And the thesis of this broader project is that biblical prophecy is a thoroughly embodied phenomenon whose contours emerge most clearly in the complex interplay of embodied experience, affect, action and interaction, and reception. And I regard word and body not as separate categories for us to examine, but that we should examine them as intertwined and synergistic. So a focus on prophetic actions and interactions is coming in the second installment in the trilogy, and a focus on reception as embodied reception is coming in the third installment. This book, The Prophetic Body, has two main tasks. So in part one, which is chapters 1 and 2, I assess the prevalence, the implications, and the origins of this logocentric model of biblical prophecy. And I propose an alternative embodied paradigm of analysis. In parts 2 to 4, which is chapters 3 through 10, I focus on the prophetic body, with attention to portrayals of embodied religious experience and practice in a range of texts from the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament. And I argue there that the body of the prophet is not accidental, but vital and necessary to the prophet's mediating role, and hence the subtitle of the book. So specifically, the prophet's embodied religious experience, transformations, mobility, and affect, and I'll say more about each of those things, are both means and objects of prophetic mediation. So to say it a slightly different way, the prophet's religious experience, transformations, mobility, and affect are both constitutive of how mediation occurs and a part of what is mediated. So I'll say a little more about those parts and the individual chapters. In chapter 1, the buried body, I argue for the interdependence and even interanimation of prophetic word and body. I start by analyzing the story of the unnamed man of God from Judah and the old prophet of Bethel in 1 Kings 13 as a kind of parable about prophecy that places both word and body at prophecy's center and inseparably links the two. I then document recent turns to the body and a turn to religious experience in biblical studies, survey some of the scholarship that has laid the groundwork for this analysis, and analyze the factors in the biblical prophetic corpus itself that have contributed to the logocentric model of prophecy. And then I trace a further influence of a dualistic hierarchy of mind and word on the one hand and body on the other in Western culture in ancient and modern periods. So sort of a how we got here. And then in the second chapter, re-embodying biblical prophecy, I look at how we can move forward. So that chapter is kind of giving you the nuts and bolts, the scope, the methodology, the guiding assumptions for the study, and laying out this embodied paradigm of analysis. So parts 2 to 4 are where the interpretive work happens. And I use examples drawn from the major prophets, the Book of the 12, as well as narratives about prophets from elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament to examine diverse embodied dimensions of prophetic experience, practice, and affect, ranging from multisensory encounters with God to visionary ecstasy, transport, and a prophetic pedagogy of wonder. The study of the prophet's embodied religious experience begins in part 2, which is called Called in the Flesh. I analyze 4 prophetic call stories or commissioning narratives, starting with Moses in chapter 3, and Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel in chapter 4. And I argue that the embodied encounter between prophet and deity or other supernatural agents enables and shapes the prophet's embodied mediation between deity and people. I also argue that there's a key difference between Moses' call narrative and the other 3 that I mentioned, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and that's the style of narration. The third person narration of Moses' commissioning creates distance, and it establishes the uniqueness of Moses as privileged and archetypal mediator, while the multisensory first-person commissioning narratives of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel create a sense of immediacy and transport the audience into the vision, bringing them to that moment of divine encounter in a way that they also experience it in their own bodies. So where Moses' call is recruiting elders and his brother, the first person call stories recruit the audience and engage the bodies of readers and hearers in activities of embodied reception. And that's actually a little preview of where that third book in this trilogy is going to go, or one direction that book will go. So part 3 of the book is called Transformations, and it examines 2 types of bodily transformations, and in each case attending to the relationship between the prophet's bodily transformation and that work of mediation. Chapter 5 is called Becoming Other, and uses monster theory to examine the visible transformations of Moses and Miriam in Exodus 34 and Numbers 12. And I look at their bodies as border bodies that inhabit but also cross the boundaries between human and divine realms. And I also see a contrast where Moses' transformation is giving visible bodily form to the liminality and power of the prophetic role. It also isolates him. Miriam's transformation isolates her too, but it curtails her prophetic power by denying her access to God, people, and place. In chapters 6 and 7, I examine 3 sets of transformative embodied practices and forms of religious experience that are connected with the role of prophet. So those are ascesis, or ascetic practice, incubation, and ecstasy. So embodied practices like fasting, withdrawal, and incubation, which refers to spending the night in a sanctuary to receive a vision, as well as sensory and behavioral triggers like music and dancing, even physical proximity to liminal places could each open channels of contact between human and divine realms. And I argue that through these practices and experiences and the resulting contact, the prophetic body becomes a locus and conduit of divine power and knowledge. That body becomes a kind of bridge across these boundaries and mediates relationship across boundaries of being and possibility. And finally, in part 4, a section called Emotion and Affect, I focus on 2 types of movement and change that are crucial to the role of prophet. So the prophetic body is not static, it's dynamic. So mobility and affect are the focus in part 4. Chapter 8 examines prophetic mobilities and immobilities, and I argue that prophetic experiences of locomotion and transport are not simply prefatory or auxiliary to prophetic mediation. It's not just about how the prophet gets to the place where the prophet is going to do the thing, but they're actually a key component of prophetic mediation and prophetic mission. And the book's final chapters, 9 and 10, so chapter 9 is called Anger and Tears, and chapter 10, Devastation and Wonder, argue that prophetic affect too is also integral to what and how a prophet mediates. And I look there at the examples of Jonah and Jeremiah in chapter 9, and Ezekiel, and my all-time favorite, Daniel, in chapter 10. So these chapters together are showing that the body of the prophet is not incidental or ancillary to the work of prophetic mediation. It's not an impediment to that work. It is a primary locus of prophetic experience and activity, and it's a crucial means of prophetic mediation. Prophetic word and body are not binary opposites. They operate in synergy. Studies of biblical prophecy, as I mentioned at the beginning, have long focused on the prophetic word. So this more integrated approach to biblical prophecy widens the focus to include the prophetic body. Thank you.
Thank you, Thea. That was a great summary. So we'll turn to our first panelist, Jamie, for her response to the book.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Archie and Joshua, for the invitation to be on this panel. This approach to reviewing a publication is dynamic and engaging, allowing panelists to put a recent work into conversation with our research. I'm happy to have been able to spend extended time wrestling with the prophetic body and thinking through how it might complicate, inform, and enhance my work. Thea, thank you for your thoughtful and thought-provoking volume and for your summary of it just now. And congratulations on your accomplishment. Your work is excellent, and I look forward to sharing what your volume sparked within me I'm happy to be here with you and Esther, Julie, and Megan as conversation partners. So in the book and in the remarks you just shared, you add much to how we think about prophecy. Your summary was really helpful and emphasized the many ways that the prophetic body acts as a communicator, not only speaking through words, but through its presence and actions. Your volume helps us to adjust the tendency to think of prophecy as only logocentric, instead viewing embodiment and mediation more broadly as ways to communicate prophetically through word and body. In thinking about the relationship between the word and the body, I tried to consider an example that might add on to the many that are found in your book. Now, as you note, the book of Jeremiah is a great place to explore the prophetic body. Jeremiah's body is on full display on multiple occasions with references to his bones, his loins, his neck, along with various emotional expressions of fear, anger, and grief. Jeremiah is one of the most useful books, I think, for exploring the dynamics of the prophetic body, as his body not only enhances the prophetic word, it serves as a witness and a statement on its own. Now, a text that I considered in light of your discussion of word and body is Jeremiah 27 and 28, the narrative in which Jeremiah is instructed to strap a yoke on his neck, and then he sends yokes to kings in the region. Now, the yoke symbolizes subjugation and serves as a visual sign of control and domination that they would all face. And Jeremiah puts his neck under the yoke, and the kings are told to do the same, thus submit to Babylon. Anathea's work made me think more about the impact of a yoke on the body and how wearing a yoke would convey a prophetic message, even without words. The yoke is not just mentioned to symbolize oppression, but by wearing the yoke, Jeremiah performs and embodies the burden that comes during periods of oppression, evoking thoughts of abuse, forced labor, and loss of power and control. Now, being more attentive to the prophetic body, I imagined ways that Jeremiah's posture would be affected by holding the yoke, his wincing at each turn, or limping, moaning, and showing physical distress. The prophetic body would convey more fully what Babylonian control would entail. Now, in addition, the context for when this action occurs is notable for thinking about prophecy. Jeremiah wears the yoke in a narrative about false prophets and other mediators. The text is concerned about not listening to the words of prophets, diviners, dreamers, and other mediators who are discouraging servitude to Babylon. Jeremiah doesn't just demonstrate subjugation, but through his actions and words, he embodies true prophecy and amplifies his message within the context of false prophets. Now, building on this theme, in Jeremiah 28, with the prophet Jeremiah still in his yoke, he faces off with the prophet Hananiah. And I say it that way on purpose. The MT of chapter 28 repeatedly calls Jeremiah and Hananiah prophets. In its 17 verses, there are 16 occurrences of Navi, 6 in connection to Hananiah, 5 in connection to Jeremiah, and the rest are references to both true and false prophets. So the repetition is notable and emphasizes the prophetic title in a way that's not found elsewhere in the book. For instance, in verse 5, the prophet Jeremiah, quote, the prophet Jeremiah spoke to the prophet Hananiah in the presence of the priests. And similarly, when Hananiah physically breaks the yoke around Jeremiah's neck in verse 10, they're both called prophets. Then the prophet Hananiah took the yoke from the neck of the prophet Jeremiah and broke it. This phrasing is not common in the book, and Jeremiah is seldom referred to as a prophet. He's called to be a prophet in chapter 1, but most usages in Jeremiah are not in reference to him, but rather to false prophets. But the concentration of the prophetic title suggests that what's happening here is very much an example of how to distinguish true prophecy from false prophecy in a context with many conflicting mediators. Interestingly, the Septuagint lacks most of the references to prophet in this passage. The MT of chapter 28 is found in chapter 35 of the Septuagint. Hananiah is introduced as a pseudo-prophet or a false prophet, so a more explicitly negative depiction than in the MT. And then the Septuagint doesn't call Jeremiah or Hananiah prophet during their encounter. And other witnesses, too, are mixed on these designations. Aquila simply calls Hananiah prophet, not pseudo-prophet. The Targum designates Hananiah as false prophet throughout the chapter. So the traditions are varied, especially on how these figures should be labeled in this scene. What we have in the MT, I think, heightens the prophetic competition and language, perhaps representing a longer, maybe expanded tradition that includes and incorporates the language of prophet throughout the text, recognizing this encounter as significant for determining a true prophet from a false prophet. And in a chapter in which the prophetic body is used along with the prophetic word, Jeremiah's prophetic status and office is stated, even overstated, in the MT. I think this convergence helps us to see the ways the biblical text affirms what Thea has demonstrated. The prophetic word and body are linked, and true prophecy can and sometimes must include both. Thea's work raised several new questions for me about the prophet and those who are in the prophetic orbit. I wondered about other bodies and the ways they affect or are affected by the prophet. Thea takes this up to some extent, for instance, in chapter 4, in the discussion of Jeremiah's mother in her treatment on Jeremiah's call narrative. But I wonder if there's more to say about her body and how it impacts Jeremiah. Can we say more about relationality and inter-embodiment and how these concepts shape how we think about Jeremiah's prophetic body in connection to his mother's body? And especially since the book mentions Jeremiah's mother on 3 occasions with explicit or implicit references to her body, and all in connection to Jeremiah's prophetic calling, the mother's body seems especially important. I also wondered if the language of incubation, which Thea used in relation to Hannah and Samuel, might be useful for thinking about Jeremiah's mother, even though the context is quite different and we don't have a robust narrative in which we see or hear her actions. But I wonder if there's something there to consider. Now, also in the discussion of Jeremiah's call, I wonder if the end of Jeremiah 1 might be relevant for speaking more about the prophetic body and words. So for instance, the deity is said to deliver judgments in verse 16, implying that those judgments would come through words. And then the prophet is told to gird his loins in verse 17, emphasizing his body and what he's about to do. So perhaps the divine origins of the words are being affirmed right alongside with the prophetic origins of the physical actions. And I also wondered about the range of how other bodies are integrated into the prophetic office. So here I leave Jeremiah and think more about the children of Hosea and Isaiah and what they add to how prophecy is delivered beyond the prophet's body via other people's bodies. So such as Gomer and the unnamed women in Isaiah and their children, whose names and lives are a type of prophetic statement and witness. And so to conclude, when thinking about prophets, along with other figures of mediation, priests come to mind as mediators between humans and the divine. They share in common some designations and separations from the community, but priests have more formalized and regulated actions. Prophets have more freedom, kind of to some extent. And although there are certain divinatory practices that are prohibited or regulated, prophets perhaps have more latitude in what, where, and how their work is done. As for modern examples, I hope that any number of vocations, when done well, have elements of the prophetic word and body as instruments for motivating and responding to challenges today. This could include good religious leaders, teachers, healthcare professionals, basically any role in which the body and word work in tandem. And so with that, I'll give the floor to the next panelist to continue the conversation.
All right, thank you, Jamie. Look forward to the conversation. Our next panelist is Esther. So Esther, turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So I wanted to start with my warmest gratitude to CBA for organizing this wonderful panel, to my fellow panelists for sharing their insights, but most of all to Thea for creating such an important and rich work. That said, it is a little bit ironic that a work that rightly rejects the ideal of mind-body dualism seems to be exactly what it says the prophets are not, a written work of keen intellectual acuity, erudition, and persuasive argumentation. Even this panel is electronically facilitated, the power of Zoom making conversation possible, but removing the element of face-to-face experiential intimacy. But the good news is that until we're all brains in jars, it's impossible to remove the element of embodiment from human experience and cognition. I read this book while drinking hot cardamom-scented Yemenite coffee, and its milky, bitter kick energized me as I underlined the book's words with a scratchy mechanical pencil. Embodiment, as Thea teaches us, pervades every aspect of our life, what we think, what we feel, and what we do. And of course, this is a truth that scholars of disability in particular have been communicating for ages, but the prophetic body harnesses it to systematically dismantle the prevalent logocentric tendencies of biblical scholarship when it comes to prophecy. So when it came to connecting Thea's insights to my own research, I honestly felt overwhelmed by possibility, despite the fact that most of my work thus far hasn't actually focused on the corpus of prophecy in particular. Given the limited time, I'm going to focus on just two sites of intersection, metaphor theory and eunuchs, and conclude with a turn to mediation in the present. So starting off, my experience when reading the chapter on prophetic motion, and Jonah's section in particular, was one of recognition and delight. In an article in Religion Compass that actually coincidentally came out yesterday, I briefly discussed Jonah's peregrinations as an example of metaphor realized in narrative. I'll explain what I mean. As conceptual metaphor theorists have been telling us for 40 years, metaphors aren't just figures of speech. They identify cognitive connections between different realms of human experience. And one such connection is the way we use physical movement as a way to think about abstract progression, a cognitive metaphor with manifestations like faithful behavior is a journey, in phrases like, your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. But in the book of Jonah, that metaphoric association gives Jonah's decision to abandon God's physical directions an additional weight and resonance. I particularly loved Thea's description of him fleeing to the fluid non-place of the sea. I love that. When a given cognitive metaphor shapes the actual narrative details of a story, it's an example of narrative realization of the metaphor. The metaphor is both literally true and cognitively resonant. For instance, the Psalms speak often of the shelter of God's shade, and Jonah sees that metaphor realized when God gives him the kikayon plant to block the sun. And I bring all this up not just because I think it's a specific intersection between my own work and the prophetic body, but because I think there's an important idea here that I honestly haven't fully untangled myself, which is the way that prophets embody and enact metaphors to convey ideas in a way that, like most metaphor, surpasses simple one-to-one translation. The thing about metaphors is that they harness a network of what Max Black called associated commonplaces. The fact that when I call God a king, it has a host of associations beyond just he rules over people. Likewise, when Ezekiel eats the scroll, another act with classic metaphorical resonance, and I'll give you a minute to digest how that one works, it has all sorts of cognitive associations. So what does that all mean in the light of embodiment? Is the prophet someone whose body becomes a metaphor for divine revelation? And if so, how does that connect to other biblical figures who become metaphors, like the Sotah, whose body becomes an oath in Numbers 5, or 2nd Isaiah's mysterious suffering servant? What was the ancient Israelite understanding of how a person could more or less literally embody an idea? I am not enough of an expert on prophecy to solve these questions, but I will suggest that conceptual metaphor theory might hold some tools for seeking the answers. With that, I will shift to my second topic, which, as far as I know, wasn't actually mentioned directly at all in the book, which is the subject of eunuchs. My recent work has focused primarily on the Book of Esther, and I have argued that its eunuchs play a crucial role as intermediaries. as characters whose ability to cross lines of gender and status enables them to facilitate the exchange of objects and ideas. But the first time that I examined the etymology of the word intermediary, I was both fascinated and perplexed. An interstate highway travels between states. An interpersonal communication travels between persons. But how can someone travel between the medius, the middle? What is an intermediary doing? So this is where I take a step to the left and into the world of queer theory. And to be clear, I'm not unequivocally equating eunuchs with modern queer folks, as Joseph Marshall has vocally argued against doing. But I do think that eunuchs are queering figures, as Sean Burke argued in Queering the Ethiopian Eunuch. They're figures whose appearance in a narrative points to the spaces outside and around and between those middle spaces of unambiguous identity, whether that identity is connected to gender or race or disability. To be queer is to be marginal, to find strength and joy in a non-normative identity. And in a world obsessed with reproductive futurism, the inherently non-procreative bodies of eunuchs inherently point outside normativity. Now, this makes eunuchs another example of biblical figures who physically embody an idea, but their connection to prophets may also go beyond that. Eunuchs were specifically royal intermediaries, people whose altered bodies meant they could listen and speak to the king in a special capacity. So throughout the book of Esther, they transmit his messages and they even propose ideas to the king, as when Harbonus suggests executing Haman. And if God is metaphorically a divine king, an idea that permeates the Hebrew Bible, then perhaps the prophets were the metaphorical equivalent of the king's eunuchs. Indeed, elsewhere in the Near East, we may see an affinity between prophecy and figures who cross gender boundaries. Marty Nissanen has written about the Asinu, gender-crossing priests of Mesopotamia who had both male and female associations. Not all Asinu prophesied, but they were grouped together with the standard prophets in ration distribution lists and lexical lists, and we have a couple of specific prophecies from Mari attributed to them. We also have the fascinating figure of Daniel the prophet, whom Thea does discuss as a figure who mediates by participating in affective economies. While the Bible doesn't directly identify him as a eunuch, most of the ancient rabbis actually did, and he and his friends were kept by the Sar HaSarasim, the master of the eunuchs. It is, of course, difficult to build a discussion on a detail missing from the text, but Karen Tamburozanow has recently argued that whether or not Daniel was physically a eunuch, he was a queer figure. He disrupted reproductive futurism and chrononormativity. He exhibited theatrical jouissance. And I would love to see an intersection between these queer analyses and the focus on embodiment in the prophetic body. Could Daniel's queer and perhaps physically liminal body have reinforced and enabled his role as a mediator of divine knowledge? I want to conclude by turning to the final question posed by the moderators for the session. Are there examples of this type of prophetic mediation today? My answer, broadly speaking, is to look to the margins, because the intermediaries of today, those who embody the divine word corporeally, are rarely found in spotlights and mainstreams. But if I had to pick a single space to look for God's voice made manifest in the bodies of modern mediators, I would look at the precious bodies of trans and non-binary youths. These are young people whose very flesh reflects the struggle between the weight of their self-knowledge and the assumptions and assignments of society. Now, political discourse about these young people has become ubiquitous in our society, and I'm not trying to dive into it, let alone solve it in 5 minutes. But what I want to suggest is that trans youths have all gone through a process of calling to a different mode of physical being. They are keenly aware of the significance of embodied changes, from the length of a haircut to the constant pressure of a chest binder. They know the role of shifting space and place in determining who they are allowed to be. And they are very familiar with the affective weight of an existence that provokes strong feelings from stranger and family alike. So if God does speak today, then perhaps we should listen for where that divine voice resonates in the bodies and voices and experiences of these sacred young people. And with that, I'll finish up and let the other panelists have their say. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about such an important book.
All right. Esther, thank you so much. Look forward to that conversation. Julie, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be part of this exciting panel discussion all the way from South Africa. Yeah, and also, Anathea, thank you so much for this wonderful book and also sharing it with me as I've been working on my new project on Nahum. And I've used your work already in some of my writings, but also in class, sort of we actually just today also spoke about some of your work also in here. So very, yeah, it's been really important work. And so I look forward to see how it trickles down into the scholarly discourse and also the future installments. So we've been asked to how this relates to our own research. And yeah, to make choices, but I think I sort of decided to speak especially about how the prophet's body speaks beyond in tandem with the prophetic word, as this relates to my own work also on Jeremiah and Jonah as traumatized prophets. So sort of, with Jamie and Esther, I mean, yeah, so you'll see some of the resonances there as well. So at a recent, rather traditional conference on Deuteronomy, so I fruitfully used your work to argue that both Jonah and Jeremiah embody or re-embody what is considered as the quintessential understanding of the prophet in ancient Israel. So Anathea argues that in Deuteronomy 18:9 to 22, the prophetic word is being privileged with prophets speaking words. Authentic prophets speak God's word. So despite this emphasis on verbal mediation, she shows how already in Deuteronomy 18:9 to 22, one sees something of the contested character, phenomenological complexity, and plural forms of prophetic mediation that will be evident in the rest of the biblical literature. So indeed, especially in the context of the trauma wrought by the Babylonian invasion and exile, what it means to be a prophet required reimagination as the prophetic identity and the role of prophets like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Jonah subvert such strict control as evidence in Deuteronomy 18, and they embody in new ways what is understood under the prophetic word and vocation. So in my time sort of maybe thinking about, this notion of where Jeremiah and Jonah, the resonance is also between them and how that also then relates to some of the work you have done, but also take it a bit further in terms of this notion of embodiment as well. So for the Oxford Handbook on Jeremiah, I've written on the traumatized prophet Jeremiah, who's broken because of the brokenness of his people, with their wounds becoming his words. And, a number of places, for instance, in the Confessions of Jeremiah, we encounter the portrait of a conflicted individual deeply plagued by an inner struggle and turmoil. In Jeremiah 15:10, the prophet bitterly laments the fact that he ever had been born, describing himself as a man of strife and contention, who couldn't sit in the company of merrymakers, nor could he rejoice. And then also the social disintegration is evident also as on a symbolic level as what the people experience in terms of their alienation, during this time also of exile. We've seen this especially in the context of Jeremiah 20, verse 14 and 18, where he then also curses the day of his birth, and, sort of making connection also with Job, wishing, lamenting, why did I come forth from the womb to see toil and sorrow, spend my days in shame. So again, how the words of what he's saying is also relating to his bodily experience. I mean, so interesting parable, how this comes in narrative form and the stories that speak of the prophet's incarceration, and how these stories of imprisonment and confinement on a symbolic level expresses the utter isolation and breaking of social bonds experienced not only by the traumatized prophet, but also by the social collapse of the community at large. So this relates for me very much by what Thea has argued, that Jeremiah's body is a site of encounter, intersection, and relationship between God and people, and a means by which he simultaneously participates in and is shaped by and shapes divine and human realities. So this theme of the traumatized Jeremiah also became very much the framing also of my commentary for on Jonah. So Esther, I would love to see what you've written also now. Jonah has been delivered safely to the other shore though. But this idea of a wounded prophet Jonah who represents his wounded community in a symbolic narrative of trauma and resilience. So I argue that Jonah is another example of a prophetic embodiment in which the prophet's body speaks beyond in tandem with the prophetic word. As the unlikely prophet who quite dramatically fled away from God, sort of caught in a divinely induced storm, and then this downward journey that you also speak about, sinking, into the depths of the deep, only to be swallowed by the big fish. So Jonah's body indeed is speaking without speaking long before the exceedingly short prophetic speech and he utters in Jonah 3:5. So, but moving a bit further about this notion that the movement of the prophet's body is the message, I focus also more reading this through a trauma lens, also on some of the sort of him as a traumatized figure, sort of in terms of the depression, the fact of his series of attempts of self-erasure, sort of, in terms of that Jonah's flight is not just away from God, but also his community and from the enemy who wounds through violence and oppression. And so drawing on the work also of Elizabeth Boas and Sarah Agnew. But I think very interesting is also this downward movement into the fish. And this is, I want to maybe focus on that also as terms of this sojourn of this journey within the fish and how that also shapes then sort of the prophetic body in interesting ways. So in this queer moment of being swallowed by a whale becomes illustrated when one realizes that, as scholars like Amy Erickson have argued, this is no ordinary fish, but a gender-bending fish. So commentators throughout the ages have been intrigued, or one could say confounded, by the fact that it's a male fish that swallows Jonah, but that Jonah then proceeds to prey from the belly, or rather the womb, of a female fish. So opening up a range of metaphorical associations that fruitfully may be explored in rethinking the prophetic body and vocation. I draw on this in the work of Sarah Ahmed, which argued that bodies are shaped by the space they inhabit. She argues that bodies are submerged such that they become the space they inhabit. In taking up space, bodies move through space and are affected by the wear of that movement. Through this movement, the surface of spaces as well as bodies take shape. So in terms of Jonah, this particular orientation, this particularly peculiar space have distinct implications of how one thinks about the prophetic body that hardly fits the typical profile of the Israelite prophecy. So Amy Erickson also draws on some of the metaphorical possibilities associated with a gender-bending fish, the role of birth imagery, sort of that the prophet's at the crossroads of life and death. But with these places of death, like the Sheol, but exhibit strangely womb-like features capable of offering comfort and protection. So that she argues then, and I use that also in my commentary, that she's not, that Jonah's not merely entombed, but rather enwombed. And sort of that this space then of the fish becomes sort of a place of reorientation in which the prophetic body is transformed. Also make a connection then between the work, also on the example of the traumatized prophet Jeremiah, and the suffering, expressing his suffering also in lament. So as you also talk about the notion of anger and tears, but that this notion of lament and resistance shows then also a prophet, a body. Rhiannon and Grable speak about the body in pain, but also in defiance. So Jonah, as a wounded yet defined body, impacts our understanding of his prophetic identity that not only destabilizes masculinity and undoes the body, but with this undoing opens new possibility of being and becoming. And this is the work that Grable has done also in Are We Not Me? So I would argue in conversation, we're also with Dia's work, that in the case of Jeremiah and Jonah, we see two very good examples of prophetic mediation in which the prophetic body speaks in tandem and beyond the prophetic word. So both Jeremiah and Jonah, I would argue, are symbolic figures representing the communities as they communicate the prophetic word, not just what they say, but also how their bodies move in the world. That is what they see and hear and feel and lament and move or not move, as Anathea shows beautifully throughout the book, which is in itself a powerful witness. So maybe to end off, so why is this important for us? Why is it important for our students? And even today, fighting them, but, sort of not to spiritualize also the body and sort of try to be able to understand the embodied nature of bodies, which is still not the norm for many people. And I think what your point, why this is so important, is that, and I want to, this quote that you says as well, that the reason why I think your book is so important is that privileging words, writing, mind, or reason has also often meant privileging the people most closely associated with them, including men, white people, and colonizers, and has supported modern systems and structures of domination. Devaluing and obscuring the role of the body has often also meant the subordination and erasures of people with marked bodies, including women, people of color, members of lower socioeconomic classes, and people with disabilities. And with Esther, I would also argue various peoples of sexual minorities as well. And then quoting, I'm so glad you cited Sean Burke's lovely essay, my favorite quote in Queer Biblical Interpretation, would say a renewed focus on the prophetic body. The value of that would be to make it possible for more bodies to matter, for more bodies to be recognized as fully human. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. That was good. Look forward to the conversation. Thank you for your comments. Megan, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you to Archie and Joshua for organizing this really engaging panel. Thank you to Esther, Julie, and Jamie for your thought-provoking responses, and to Thea for writing this rich volume. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while now, and so far it has not disappointed. Look at this amazing panel that I get to be on, and I don't even work on the Hebrew Bible. I am very lucky. Now the Sesame Street song about one of these things doesn't belong is running through everyone's head. All right, so Dr. Portier-Young's The Prophetic Body is a tour de force of historical, theoretical, and exegetical insights into the Hebrew Bible, and specifically Hebrew Bible prophecy. Portier-Young asks us to consider seriously the ways in which logocentric views of prophecy have impoverished our view of prophecy in the Hebrew Bible and its reception, and as Julie has just reminded with that wonderful quote, the violence that is perpetuated when we ignore the body and its role in prophecy. Through 10 exegetically rich and methodologically dexterous chapters, The Prophetic Body reframes everything that you thought you knew about ancient prophecy, its audience, and its impact. Thea calls her methodology interdisciplinary on page 251, but I think this undersells it quite a bit because she invites her readers to become polymaths along with her, pulling selectively and deftly from a seemingly bottomless methodological toolkit as the situation demands, and with methods that match the socio-historical, literary contexts and exegetical problems of the passage in question. It is at this point that I want to emphasize that Portier-Young's reframing of the prophetic is not forced. This is not just a book that runs prophets through the filter of embodiment with methodological shimmer and sparkle, though there is methodological shimmer and sparkle, but instead highlights the thematic and historical claims that she's making by revivifying key passages and engaging all of the relevant secondary scholarship. You feel like you have read the manifold library that she has read, and it is a lot. So here, I think that Dr. Portier-Young is doing important socio-historical recovery of the embodied experience of the prophet and the hearers of the prophet, but also of the reception history of prophecy, though we're promised more of that reception history in future volumes. And unlike other recovery projects, we do not, as readers, get the sense that the itinerary was written before she has taken the journey. The result is a work that is itself a lively encounter and, in a word, prophetic. So if I have to pick who the prophets are in our midst, that's Dr. Portier-Young is one of them. Word and body disability and emotion, and apocalyptic and prophetic genre are the three categories where there's overlap with my own work. So as someone who's currently working on closely related questions around prayer and the body, I found the social histories of word-body dualism and prophecy that you offered in those first two chapters to be extremely helpful. In my own work, I've been asking time and time again, how did we get here? When exactly did this start? Who did this? And I've been particularly dissatisfied with answers that rightly place some of the blame on Descartes. He doesn't get away scot-free, but then they stop there and look nowhere else. And for the biblical text, this is especially problematic and creates confusion around the interpretation of texts in which these dualisms are native to the texts themselves. This is admittedly a much bigger problem for someone like me who works primarily on texts that are formed in the world of Hellenic and Roman influence. But at several places in the text, as you were moving back and forth between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, I wondered how this might work in relation to the prophets as well, and specifically to the textual tradition and the physical act of creating the texts themselves. To what extent are the Platonic dualisms or other non-Judaic or later Judaic cultural frames of the body operative in the textual remains of the prophetic utterance? And Jamie gave some great examples of what we see when we are applying the overlap of these lenses of embodiment and manuscript tradition and the multiple traditions here to looking at how this works in specific places. But is the problem primarily how we read and encounter the prophets through the filter of millennia of dualistic thinking? Or is it also imprinted on the textual record itself? And does the redaction and transmission of these texts in diaspora contexts allow the prophetic body to begin to recede into the background, even in that earliest stage of text production? One example in my own area is in Mark 12:28 through 34, where Jesus, when he's asked about the greatest commandment, quotes Deuteronomy, but he adds to Deuteronomy's love your God with your heart, your nephesh or life and power. Mark adds that you should also love God with your whole mind. Now, we can't be completely sure why Mark does this, but one possibility is that Greek audiences might not have understood heart, cardia, as the seat of understanding, or psyche, the translation for nephesh, to refer to the whole person. Adding mind goes out of the way to ensure that the whole person is indicated, especially the mind, even to the point of redundancy. So Mark, it seems, is adding to Deuteronomy 6:4 through 5 in a way that assumes mind-body dualism as the baseline for his audience's cultural frame, not counting on anyone to hear the more holistic concept of nephesh behind the Greek psyche. So that's the textual tradition piece. Disability and emotion. So part of the prayer and the body project that I'm working on is looking at the way in which dualistic frames and thinking around prayer and the Bible have been particularly unhelpful for the way that we think about spirituality with respect to emotions, mental disabilities, anxiety, and worry. So I found myself particularly drawn to the final 3 chapters of the book on movement and immobility, anger and tears, devastation and wonder. Here, you definitely demonstrate that the prophets are engaged with the full range of human and divine emotions. The prophets function in different ways as mediators between these emotional worlds, conveying divine emotion, undergoing emotional transformation through communication with the divine. And as in other cases, like in Ezekiel, the prophet is performing emotional labor that's excruciating and disabling by any standard, ancient or modern. The attention to movement and affect in these chapters brings prophecy into 3 dimensions, requiring us to think about the ways in which movement and emotion are culturally and historically coded, and not ancillary features of prophecy, but features that do critical work of their own, as you say on page 237. I'm entirely persuaded that the prophetic is intentionally and sometimes centrally emotional work, and as such, draws upon the whole range of culturally coded understandings of emotion. And I think especially in chapter 9, I can't wait to read that chapter with my Bible for Ministers students, because the way that you talk about Jeremiah and the affective entanglement on page 225 is going to be so helpful. It's actually, this is a real strength of the emotive trajectory that you trace there, that the full range of emotions are the point, and not something to be subverted or removed, or something that's extraneous or other from the divine. And this is a very important thread of contemporary theologies of depression, like the work of John Swinton or Jessica Koblentz, and something that I think my students will find to be a really rich resource. And I think your reading of Jeremiah is really going to enhance some of those conversations. Where I had a question is, I found in chapter 10, your use of Kenneth Doka's notion of disenfranchised grief to read Ezekiel to be extremely compelling. And as you surfaced that concept, though, I found myself struggling with the role of the divine in contexts of emotional suppression, or even the emotional attunement to affective states that are culturally coded as positive or normal. As you note in chapter 10, Ezekiel's situation is very different from Jeremiah's. He does not share subjectivity with God, but is a mirror, a vehicle, a portent. And this gets to the metaphor question that Esther posed. In the disability studies world, we would call this narrative prosthesis, when a disability, even a mental disability or a physical one, is a kind of rhetorical or narrative prop, and objectifies ultimately anyone who has the subjective lived experience of that disability, but in this case also would be objectifying the prophet. So by prohibiting Ezekiel from ritual mourning, it seems like, if I'm understanding the argument correctly, God has forced Ezekiel to be the dramatic embodiment of devastation, a depression that is amplified and perhaps even manufactured by God's choice. And so, as you argue in the chapter, being unable to express grief in a ritual context is the real loss, the real source of devastation. But even according to ancient medical standards, there was an awareness that, on the part of some, not all, I want to be clear about that this kind of grief suppression was unhealthy or even harmful or cruel. So on the one hand, you have Stoic and Epicurean advice that many of the Hippocratics upheld, which is this idea that, if you're feeling anxious or worried, you should replace that by focusing on good things. This is the kind of philosophy that Philippians, for example, or Matthew and the do not worry passages in the New Testament is drawing upon. But Galen, the 2nd century physician, was actually critical of Stoic and Epicurean ideals around mental distress. And he points out that the kind of self-control that's prescribed by Epicurean withdrawal or Stoic responses to hardship were simply not possible for everyone. He gives the example of when his library burned and he lost his drug recipe collection. And he says that this was distressing, devastating even, but it was much easier for him to avoid distress because he had not lost everything like his neighbors and friends had. So he says, it's no great thing for me not to be grieved at all at the loss of my property, for what was left was much more than sufficient. And he says, essentially, like, I can't go tell my neighbors to don't worry about anything because their house burned down. And so the fact that I'm able to like subvert my worries by thinking about nice things when my recipes are what I lost is a little gaslighty. That's my word, not his. But Vivian Nutton has argued that, that Stoic or Epicurean tolerance, the going mental health prescription of the day, was probably beyond most people. And so for the vast majority of ancient people, I think the conventional wisdom about mental comportment might have been aspirational or more likely entirely out of reach. And so I'm wondering, like, how we handle in these texts when we know that, yes, like, these are prescribed mental health practices of the ancient world, and we have God and the prophets kind of acting out some of these practices in these texts. What do we do about the fact that some of the people that could never achieve the standards of health are having the standards of non-health manufactured for them by someone else higher on the power scale? So to what extent does Ezekiel's compounded or disenfranchised grief give voice to a critique of ancient power dynamics that allowed those in power to manufacture mental illness, devastation, and depression for some people and not others? And how do we re-inflesh ancient emotions without rebirthing some of their entanglements in moral and philosophical systems that were predicated on abuses of power, and borrowing from Angela Parker's work, what I'm calling gaslighting moralities. And then the final question that I have, and I promise this is a short one, is about apocalyptic and genre definition. So throughout the book, there's this emphasis on embodied sensory experiences that prophetic utterance and encounter evoke, a set of experiences that are very closely related to the encounter with apocalyptic ekphrasis, the phenomenon of vivid rhetoric that apocalyptic authors use to bring together strange combinations of images that don't really go together in order to emotionally move their audience. In my own work, I'm starting to think about redefining apocalyptic by centering the pieces of apocalyptic literature that have defied definition. It's those very strange and weird images that we struggle ourselves to understand and describe that pull at the emotions, that engage the body, and did so in their ancient context as well. And scholars, of course, have puzzled for centuries about the borderlands between prophecy and apocalyptic, and even the overlap in their rhetorical orientations at certain moments. So I guess it's not a surprising point of contact, and maybe even why I was invited. But my question is, how does re-enfleshing the prophets necessitate a redefinition of the prophetic? You hint at this on page 250, and you give a good explanation of why you're defining the prophetic this way in your own work. But I'm wondering if your broader definition is not just necessary for framing this book or this 3-book set, but something that should reset the agenda for how we think about our scholarly analysis and categories of literary analysis of the Hebrew Bible. Should the piece of the prophetic encounter that has defied definition, here the embodied reality, perhaps become definitional? As you can perhaps tell from this final leading question, I think that the answer is yes, and that Portier-Young's work is making an impact on the very foundations of research on biblical prophecy. This volume is a treasure for those of us who work on the body in various ways, on gender, on sexuality, but its impact is much broader than the title might suggest, requiring us to rethink many of the fundamentals of biblical studies research. And I am very much looking forward to traveling the novel avenues of inquiry that you have paved for us alongside my companions on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. I really look forward to hearing you redefine apocalyptic. This is going to be fun. But so we're going to take a very brief break. It is 11:13 now. So what do you recommend, Joshua?
For matters of accessibility, I would say a 5-minute break gives people time to get up and then come back.
Okay, so 11:18 will restart, and Thea will respond to the panelists, and then we'll open up for discussion with what time we have left. Okay.
Excellent. See you all in a few minutes.
All right. All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. Those of you on the panel and those of you in the audience, thank you for joining us. We're now going to allow or ask Thea, not allow, but ask Thea to respond to our panelists' comments on the volume, and then we will open up a discussion, an open discussion between the panelists and Thea, and then invite our audience to participate. So Thea, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Archie. And so the first thing to say is just how humbled I am and honored and deeply grateful for the rich, gracious, thoughtful, and stimulating remarks from Jamie, Esther, Julie, and Megan. And I'm also excited by what you've each shared about your own work in progress and the ways that the prophetic body connects to your work and generates new questions and opens the door for fresh insights. The most exciting thing to me about my own work is always thinking about what someone else might do with that question or that idea or that connection or resource. So just kind of like seeing the wheels starting to turn, like that's why we do it, right? So this is really just a terrific moment. And I wish that in that 5-minute break, I had time to like make an outline of all the things I wanted to respond to and talk to. I did not have time to do that. So I'm going to kind of like visually scan through my notes of the points that were raised and the questions that were asked. So, first of all, Jamie, I loved thinking with you about Jeremiah 27 and 28 and that face off, as you put it, between Jeremiah and Hananiah, and sort of what role does the body play in how we distinguish between true and false prophecy, which I remember as a student. So my doctor, Father Jim Crenshaw, was very interested in the question of prophetic conflict, and the different criteria that you find articulated in various different texts in the Hebrew Bible, in terms of how you would differentiate and how you would distinguish. And so you're digging into that story and the way the story thematizes the role of prophet, and doesn't deny Hananiah that role, but wants us to see the contrast, maybe invites us into the costliness, the way that the prophet's embodiment of true prophecy might in fact be something very costly, and that perhaps that's part of where the contrast lies in that particular narrative. But that also, to me, connects to what Megan asked us to think about in considering the example of Ezekiel 24 and disenfranchised grief, and this kind of prophetic prosthesis where the prophet is asked to simply become a living example, a living prognostication, and to suffer in the process, in a way that instrumentalizes the prophet's own embodied experience of grief, of loss, of the lack of a kind of social container for that grief and loss, and the lack of connection in that moment, when grieving would otherwise be the warranted response. And I think there does seem to be a cruelty there, and just a surface level reading of that passage. With one blow, I am about to take away from you the delight of your eyes, yet you shall not mourn or weep. It's an incredibly theologically challenging, difficult, problematic text, right? And so that's something, I think for myself, like I certainly like want to call attention to the ways that the prophet's body is so vividly involved in a way that we can risk kind of romanticizing that theologically, and so kind of catching that, like, wait a minute, this is something that has both positive theological payoff, right, and also brings with it some problems. When the mediator is when their own suffering is instrumentalized in that way, and when, and this goes also, Jamie asked us to think about the conclusion of Jeremiah's call, where Jeremiah is told to gird his loins and sort of adopt a particular affective posture, to make himself kind of rock solid for this task, which in a very similar way is sort of excluding a performance of or visible signs of human vulnerability, right? Like, hey, don't don't show the weakness, don't show how this might actually be hurting you to stand and be that, that person standing in between God and the people, and kind of taking the brunt of their frustration and anger, and taking the brunt of what's being demanded of you. And God says, don't, in effect, like don't break, or I will break you. And it's, to go back to some of the issues that Megan raised, there's it has a kind of abusive feel to me when I read that, and a kind of commanded limiting of one's emotional and affective performance in order to meet a script, right, that someone else has set. And when I think about the connections, and I think you were starting to push us in this direction, Megan, some of the connections to present day context, and how this becomes relevant for our thinking about the role of the body, the role of emotion in the religious life, in the church, in churches, plural, and so on. We become aware of the realities of religious abuse, and this goes to the power issues that you raised and others raised as well. And so, my hope in that, as so often, this is, one of when we encounter these kind of theologically problematic texts, like I always tell my students, I can't resolve that problem for you, right? Like, I need you with me to let's hold that problem, let's wrestle with it. And also, can it cause us to pay better attention where we see that problem in our society, in our churches, right? And if we're able to recognize, this is a problem, let's recognize it in the text and in the spaces that we're involved in as well. So without having like the tidy resolution, that would be one of the things I would want us to keep leaning into. And you mentioned the work of Angela Parker and others who are kind of pushing us in these directions. So I was so glad that you named that. I really appreciate, Esther, kind of where you started in your comments, thinking about the irony of the way that we do our work, right, and just how much of that continues to privilege the word, whether that's the spoken word or the written word. And one thing I can share is so this project really grew out of years and years of teaching, and I have taught a number of times a seminar called Biblical Bodies. And to your point, like the first time I taught that seminar, some of the evals were like, great class, and like this class is like weirdly like way up here, and what about us down here? And so in future iterations of the class, we began to incorporate embodied practices in the class. And, sometimes that included dancing and kind of developing ways of performing the text in movement. And in a few weeks' time, I get to be a guest in a class at Duke in dance studies where they will have read parts of this book, and the class begins with, in effect, interpretive dance that is kind of responding to the readings through movement. And I'm really excited both to like be a part of that and see that and participate in that, but also to think about how can that change my understanding of and my approach to my pedagogy, my work. I feel like we have a lot to learn from disciplines that maybe do a better job of that integration. So I loved your highlighting that, and the emphasis in your comments and Megan's comments on disability scholarship, and particularly in your comments and Julie's comments on coming to the text through a queer lens, and I appreciated, Julie, you're lifting up the work of Rhiannon Graybill, who I would say whose work on destabilizing masculinity in the prophetic corpus is probably the book that has done the most previously to really center our attention on the prophetic body. And so such an important work to acknowledge in this conversation. And you know, at the same time, the approach of queering wasn't the primary approach in the prophetic body. And so I really deeply appreciated the prompt to kind of keep thinking about how are these prophetic bodies also queer bodies, and to particularly let me come back to particularly to think about you know, when you at the very beginning of the introductions, when your work on eunuchs was mentioned, and my first thought was to go to Daniel and the Daniel traditions. And so I really love this this question about, is the prophetic body as intermediary sort of fundamentally a queer body, and does that get kind of literalized narratively in the case of someone like Daniel? And you mentioned Nasina's work. Corey Carvalho has also looked at like Jeremiah's relationship to God, and his being told, you know, not to enter into certain kinds of relationship as a way of possibly flagging his own relationship with God as a kind of queer relationship, right? And so yeah, I'm gonna keep thinking about, is this prophetic role presented to us as fundamentally a queer and queering role? So I really appreciated that that analysis. And Julie, I really again was so excited to hear how already Julie had reached out to me before the book had come out, or right around the time that it was coming out, and I was able to share with her some advanced version. So it's really exciting to me that already this book and some of the ideas in it have contributed to your ongoing work. And the way you put it, that Jonah's body speaks without speaking long before his short, prophetic speech, right? For that, people always say, like, oh, of all the prophets, Jonah only says 5 words. This idea that that prophecy has already begun, I just found really powerful, and I loved the way that your work and Esther's work on Jonah's peregrinations, to use Esther's language, intersect around this theme. I want to come back to related to that, Esther. You talked about this, the ways that the prophet's body literalizes, maybe that wasn't the word that you used. That's was that the word that you used? Literalize?
Realizes.
Thank you. Okay, I'm getting literalized from like other things that I had read previously, but realizes the metaphor. And there's, for me, I feel like there's so much more reading that I want to do in metaphor theory. And you've now pointed me in some new directions on that, that I was less aware of. in conversations around divine embodiment right now, right, there's a lot of debate and kind of ferment and conversation around, if we were in effect require metaphor to comprehend, conceptualize the God that we're in relationship with, how does that fundamentally alter our theology, shape our theology, and shape our experience, right? So it's not, and Esther, I'm going to kind of probably mangle some of the concepts here, but like what's kind of going around in my head is like it's not that you can say, oh, here's the metaphor over here, and here's the literal thing over here, but they're shaping each other, and the reality then becomes, I guess to use your word, the reality realizes the metaphor, but is also shaped by the metaphor. And so that's a set of questions that's very interesting to me, and I have not dug into it in the way that you have. So again, that's an area that I'm really excited to kind of keep thinking about, learning about. And so being able to think about the prophet's body as kind of participating in that. And again, to go back to this question, like what's the cost to the prophet of being that realized metaphor? And so I think it's easy to see what work it's doing, but also to how that is actually shaping the prophet's own experience and identity is really important. So I think I've said enough, but I hope that the main thing I conveyed again is that excitement. And I just really love thinking with you all about these many different directions that these ideas can go, need to go. And Megan, I echo what's already been said during our break, is how exciting your redefinition of apocalyptic literature, in part around this kind of bodily visionary experience, and what that could mean in terms of helping us think about our work with other literary genres. I'm so excited by that. Genre is a question that I am always interested in, and yeah, so thank you, and I'm really looking forward to see what you do with that.
Thank you, Thea. We now want to ask our panelists if they want to respond to any of Thea's comments. So we open it up to the panelists, and just as a reminder to those of you in the audience, if you have any questions, just please use the hand raise feature in Zoom, and we will acknowledge you and bring your question into the conversation. So panelists, don't be shy.
Maybe I can just start us off. I mean, I'm sort of really intrigued, Anathea, what you also said about the cost of sort of this on the prophetic body. And I mean, I've written about that also in terms of Jeremiah, the cost of being a prophet, and I mean, very much in terms of Jonah. And I think, I mean, in some ways that. In some ways it mirrors also, I think, the heavy burden of being a witness also to trauma, so that in what people have experienced in that communities, but that they sort of stand in that gap in terms of as a literary symbolic manifestation of what the communities experience. So so I think, I mean, maybe just something in there, I mean, the cost of trauma, the cost of war, the cost of you know, that and then in terms of how it makes sense, you know, of move forward, you know, in terms of the meaning making to work through that trauma. So yeah, so maybe just thinking about that also as the larger process of the narrativization of this traumatic process.
I saw we had a question in the chat.
Yeah, I just asked for clarification about the question. I will do my best to reintroduce the question from Luberta Gilchrist, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. I think that the question was the relationship about Jesus and understanding his prophetic body with the experience on the cross with the other two individuals. And how might that experience be reinterpreted if we looked at it through a transgender perspective? I was asking a follow-up question because I didn't quite understand. So I think the question is, how might we reinterpret Jesus's bodily experience through a transgender lens? But I'm not entirely sure. So I don't know if you'd like to start there, and we would invite Luberta to comment again to clarify the question.
And Esther, not to put you on the spot, but I meant to mention earlier also how eloquent in your comments. Wow, the way you talked about the prophetic character of transgender youth today, and the ways that they have discerned a calling, and the kind of affective experiences that and the mediatory power of their affective experiences and entanglements was incredibly just eloquent and insightful and powerful, and really kind of just like, wow. And not to put you on the spot, but I wondered if you have any thoughts in responses to Luberta's question.
Thank you for putting me on this spot. No, I'm a little hesitant to talk about this because I know there has been work done on meeting Jesus through a trans perspective, and it's not my work, and I'm not familiar enough with it to say, oh, you should read X, Y, and Z on this. But one of the things that I've always been fascinated by is the way that Jesus, by many of the church fathers, was identified with Sophia, with Lady Wisdom in the Hebrew Bible, and the idea that this is an entity who was embodied as a male human, but identified before being embodied with a female entity, spirit, whatever you want to call wisdom. So I think there is a lot of richness to looking at Jesus through a trans perspective, and thinking about how does our embodiment, how does the gender that we're assigned and then the gender that we come to identify with, how does that shape our bodily experience of the world? And how does specifically having a disjunction between those, realizing that the gender that people have always told me I am isn't the gender that I experience, how does that give you a special insight into the experience of a body that speaks, I guess, to put it bluntly, of having a body that communicates things that and interacts with your spirit and your knowledge of yourself in ways that are complicated and not and very much not binary, bifurcated, dualistic. What I'm trying to think about is how to connect that to the experience of Jesus's prophetic body. And I think that in some ways, going back to what a number of you have been talking about and what I've really enjoyed listening to, of the question of the cost on prophets, the trauma that they undergo, the reality of what it means to have yourself be made into a symbol rather than a real person, that in some ways, Jesus's experience is almost the culmination of that, is the culmination of being asked to bodily represent and respond to and suffer because of all these things that are not bodily, that are not part of his bodily cause or identity. I mean, that's the whole idea of he was without sin and bore our sins. And so I think that maybe the common thread there is differentiating between the self that you are and the self that's imposed on you, whether it's by society or by God or by this prophetic calling, and the very complicated process of navigating the relationship between those two. And I'll stop talking there.
I really appreciated your venturing into that space of talking about, texts that are outside of our shared field. I feel a little bit the same, but one of the things, and I loved how you parsed that out. One of the things kind of dovetailing with that I see, for example, in Mark's gospel, an emphasis on repeatedly on the way they taunted him, because of that disjuncture you named of the identity that he the identity that was his identity, and the identity that others were insisting on placing upon him, and that the dynamics of socially imposed shame and the even among those who shared his fate of crucifixion, right? Even those were taunting him. And so, again, not to instrumentalize in that narrative, but there may narratively be kind of points of resonance with the experience of trans people, and if we, perhaps part of the, and so of course, like Mark's gospel portrays Jesus in line with the prophets, Elijah, Elisha, right, in so many ways. So Jesus's own prophetic character is highlighted in that gospel narrative. Jesus' response is to call out to God in a way that, to go back to Megan's point and set of questions about disenfranchised grief, right? Jesus calls out to God in a way that gives expression to his feeling of abandonment by God, to his feeling that this doesn't make sense, this shouldn't be this way, right? And I wonder if that might be prophetic in that moment, that the claiming of an articulation of his grief and his own sense of justice, and that kind of bid for relationship in that moment with God. So that's one direction that I might go, that I think is not an instrumentalizing, but in fact letting his actions and speech speak in that moment in a way that is prophetic.
Thank you both for your handling of that question. And the only thing I would add from my period of history is that because crucifixion was a punishment for non-elites, I think that even kind of strengthens the reading there about the way in which particular marginalized body, like that there's a kind of double marginalization here. It's not only a excruciating and visible and physical punishment, but that represents certain things, but it's also a way of a mechanism of social control and punishment that is reserved specifically for non-elites, or to put it the other way, people who were born into different kind of socioeconomic situations would have been beheaded. So this is I think there's some more overlap there as well for narrating this from a trans lens.
Yeah,
Thank you so
have
much.
another question in the chat, unless panelists have some more comments.
All right. Emily Gathergood commented in the chat saying, thank you all so much for a fascinating discussion, and most of all to Thea for the gift of the book. I'm excited about this work, sparking productive conversations with those working on the divine body. I wonder if I could invite Thea and the others to speculate on some possible implications of the work. For example, for understanding the relationship between the prophetic body and divine bodies, especially meeting one such as angels. Thank you, Emily, for your comment. Thea?
I love this question, and and especially, I saw Megan also loves this question. I'm thinking about, like, oh, someone like Enoch, right? One of the things that we see in the portrayal of prophets and the portrayal of angelic mediators, which could, like, take that as an umbrella that might include watchers and so on, is they're awfully similar. And there's a lot of overlap in their roles, and they function in very similar ways. And we also see, especially in the moving into the apocalyptic traditions, we see that their interactions take on this, this really rich and interesting character. I'm thinking about an example in the Book of the Watchers, where Enoch ends up taking a petition to God on behalf of the fallen Watchers, and the response is, "Hey, you're supposed to be petitioning on behalf of people, not the other way around." Like, you mix that up. That kind of overlap and mix up and slippage, of course, like, gets later carried on in Enoch's own transformation. And you have figures like Moses getting in the Book of Dreams, getting transformed into this kind of angelic existence, right? And so within the tradition, we see this recognition that the functions and roles are so similar, and also there's an awareness of difference, right? That the angelic body is actually maybe not supposed to interact with human bodies in certain ways, and so that there is something unique about the human, right? Angels, one of the unique things about angels, angelic bodies, is that they can move back and forth between the heavenly realm and the human realm, right? They have access to both, and a way to get get between them. But the human mediator, while they may share so many characteristics and missional features with the angelic and other semi-divine mediators, there's also something unique about what it means to be human, even if you're the human who also is somehow embodying the divine in this human realm. They're still grounded, as it were, and still limited to this sphere for the most part, when they with the exception of an Enoch, or at the end of his earthly life, Elijah, the human mediators are only transported to the heavenly realm in visions, right? Not through other means. And so, yeah, I think I'd be rambling if I kind of kept going, but those are some of my initial thoughts. And I want us to keep asking those questions and comparing and examining those connections. And I'd love to hear if Megan or others have thoughts on those connections as well.
The reason I was shaking my head, your answer about the spatial distinction and like who can inhabit what spaces, I think is the right one. So let's just go with Thea's answer. But the whole time I'm reading the book, I have all these notes in my ebook that are like apocalyptic seer, ? And angelic, right? Because there are all these places where the description of the prophet as mediator doing this communication work sounds very much like the description of these other roles. And I think there is slippage, because I think that that's part of why it's hard to draw the boundaries in the first place, is that I think that for some people, they maybe knew that there were categories, but they were either not concerned about them in the text that they were writing, or they just said, I need this character to do this thing, and I'm not going to follow the rules. I don't know. You have in the Ascension of Isaiah, and I think Emily knows this passage well, so this might be something she's thinking about as well, but you have this thing where Jesus comes down from one heavenly level to another to get to earth, and the angels are mad because he shapeshifted to get down and they didn't see him go, and he's not supposed to be able to do that, right? Because only they can do that, and they also should know about who's going where and when, and that's how he accidentally makes it possible to be incarnate. And they're like, wait a minute, that's not your pay grade. And they're like, there's this whole thing that happens. But it's an explicit asking of that question in this very weird text about like, how do humans get from one realm to the other when they do? And what does that mean? And how is that the same or different? And so I'm wondering if as texts are playing with the characterization of different figures as prophetic, if that is part of what contributes to some of the confusion over time. And then we end up having prophetic mediators or other kinds of mediatory figures who break all the rules of space and time. And then that creates all kinds of, threads and problems in the time-space continuum, but not for the narrators of the text, who have a very handy literary device that allows these figures to do these things. So that is sort of a highly imaginative answer that moves between texts that aren't in conversation with each other, but I think it's on to that question of whether the categories always work in the same way in every place in space when we start to consider embodiment really seriously.
I think what's interesting when you're talking about the divine bodies that you get when they violate the rules of the cosmic order, like in the Book of Watchers. It's not so much when they're in contact with the prophetic being, when they take on, they kind of violate the rules and they come down and they have contact with the human realm, not so much a prophet in this case, but then they're no longer allowed to go back to that realm where they came from. So there's some kind of thing going on there where there's no longer this the same kind of relationship that they had before, where they could go back and forth like they once were able to as divine beings, like they had before, where it's like what you said, Jesus had beyond his pay grade or something like that. He could go back and forth whatever he wanted to. But now once they break the rules, and they seem to think that Jesus broke the rules, but they definitely broke the rules, and now they can't go back and forth. So I don't know if you've thought about how that plays into this whole picture of divine beings or divine bodies. I mean, it's a really interesting question that Emily asked there, that the prophetic body and divine bodies and how they're interacting. But then when the divine bodies break the rules, what's going on then, and how does that play into all this mix of this whole prophetic body and divine bodies and so
Well,
forth?
And to stay with that example for a second, so as some of you are very familiar with, when scholars look at Book of the Watchers, they see there's sort of two different accounts that are given for what was the transgression. Was it that they violated that boundary and went down and had intercourse with human women, and did a thing in that respect that angels are not supposed to do with their bodies, or do with other people's bodies? Or was it that they revealed knowledge that they shouldn't have revealed, right? And the way the story is told, well, it's both. So that brings us back kind of full circle to that idea of the synergy of word and body, the revelatory kind of boundaries and the bodily boundaries. Both are intertwined with each other in the way that story is ultimately preserved. So I find that really fascinating too.
Yeah, definitely.
And then the way in which those power relationships between the different types of mediators does or does not map on to the hierarchies of different types of intermediaries and go-betweens in the earthly realm, right? Like, so part of the implied question behind this is, to what extent is the social hierarchy of the earthly spaces that these people have in mind shaping the way that they create social hierarchy between different kinds of beings? And how are those shifts maybe tied to the shifts that we see and who's allowed to go where in different time periods?
Yeah. It's really good. Well, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time and gone over. So I just want to give Thea a moment to just say a last word, and then we will say farewell to everyone. But Thea, just you want to say a last word?
Well, my last word is just thank you. Thank you, Archie and Josh, for making this event possible and for the invitation to do this event. Thank you most especially to our incredible panelists, Jamie, Esther, Julie, and Megan. I learned so much from you today, and I'm super excited for ongoing conversation and to keep reading your work on these many questions that we talked about today. And thank you to those of you who were here with us live, and those of you who are viewing this as a recording. Really excited that you're a part of this conversation as well.
All right. I want to thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our future Unbound book reviews, which we have more coming up each month. Another one scheduled for October, right, Josh? And then a couple more in November, or at least one more in November, I think. But thank you all, and hope you have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.